would seem that Mrs. Bennet has an air of eccentricity about her, but it must be clear that the motives behind her actions are all too serious. Her daughters must be married, pure and simple. Nothing else is to be said about the matter. Herein lies the cause of her uncertain temper, and it serves to explain her discontent and her nervousness. And if her husband dies, the world would indeed come tumbling down around her. Her family would face a dire situation. It's enough to set anyone on edge, because the alternatives are next to nothing. And thus we are privy to the results when matters do not go in Mrs. Bennet's favour. To be sure, Elizabeth's refusal of Mr. Collins is borderline scandalous. We know that Elizabeth was the least dear of all her children, headstrong and foolish, and she lectures her. I tell you what, Miss Lizzie, if you take it into your head to go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all. And I am sure I do not know who is to maintain you when your father is dead. I shall not be able to keep you, and so I warn you. I have done with you from this very day. I told you in the library, you know, that I should never speak to you again, and you will find me as good as my word. Elizabeth carries on under the spectre of her mother's peevish illusions. Imagine the vitriol when Mrs. Bennet learns that Charlotte Lucas has become engaged to Mr. Collins. If Elizabeth had been surprised, Mrs. Bennet was positively outraged. Lizzie was the cause for all the mischief, and the sight of Miss Lucas became odious to her. As the newly established successor to Longbourn, she regarded her with jealous abhorrence. A week elapsed before she could see Elizabeth without scolding her, for it was her who was to blame for this dreadful state of affairs. It made her very nervous and poorly to be thwarted so in her own family. Mrs. Bennet felt strongly that Charlotte's parents were in on the game and could not interact with them without being rude. Nothing could console her, nothing could appease her, and many months would pass before she could at all think of forgiving Elizabeth, for she had been the key to preserving the Longbourn estate. It's all a frightful disaster, and she says to Mr. Bennet, how anyone could have the conscience to entail away an estate from one's own daughters, I cannot understand. And all for the sake of Mr. Collins. Why should he have it more than anybody else? Mr. Bennet flatly replied, I leave it to yourself to determine.
Mrs. Bennet's problems are compounded by the situation that unfolds between Bingley and Jane. She receives news from Bingley's sister Caroline stating that the whole party has left Netherfield by this time and have departed to London without any intention of returning. Mr. Bingley was now gone, and the news was soured by the prospect of a union between him and Georgiana, Darcy's sister. Hope was over, entirely over for Jane, and her peace was equally wounded. For the sake of remaining calm and collected, Jane says to Elizabeth, "It has not been more than an error of fancy on my side." But Lizzie chooses to believe that Bingley loves her. It's just that he's being lulled away by Caroline and Darcy, to assure that more profitable connections might prevail. Jane begins to think that her theory is quite possible, and she writes, "I should be almost tempted to say that there is a strong appearance of duplicity in all this." Mrs. Bennet feels the sting of it all in her own way. She bewailed the report of Bingley's neglect as exceedingly unlucky. It left her highly incensed, and she declared that if he did not come back, she should think herself very ill-used. And so it came to be that between Lizzie's rejection of Mr. Collins, followed by Charlotte's engagement to him, and the disappearance of Mr. Bingley, Mrs. Bennet was really in a most pitiable state. Hadn't everything been going so well?
Mrs. Bennet's dilemma, that her daughters must be married, is truly the driving force of the entire story. Does she have the right to treat Elizabeth the way she does? We know that even in the modern age, the struggles of trying to maintain a family can be heartbreaking. Many of us are only a mere paycheck away from potential destitution. How much worse could it be for someone like Mrs. Bennet, whose only prospect for securing a future for her children is to rely on the chances of a financially secure marriage proposal? Do you have any thoughts about the role that Mrs. Bennet plays in Pride and Prejudice? Let us know in the comments. Booktime Learning is dedicated to the study of writing and literature. Please consider clicking the like button and/or subscribing, and thank you for watching.